So as kind of a capstone for this whole subject, let's take what we've learned so far about pragmatics and put it in the context of the rest of linguistics. So let's look at how pragmatics fits into the other parts of grammar that you will learn about in other linguistics classes like syntax, semantics, morphology, phonology. And let's see if pragmatics is similar or different to them, and what's the relationship between pragmatics and these other parts. So what has hopefully become clear, what we've learned about grammar and pragmatics through the previous module and through the rest of this entire class, is that grammar is a system of rules. So it's a system of procedures that we follow to create language in whatever language we are using. But pragmatics, on the other hand, is about breaking rules, and it's about breaking expectations. So the whole way pragmatics works is that we know people have certain expectations about how we will communicate, and we can violate those expectations, or at least we can look like we're violating those expectations in a way that will convey or communicate some new message to people. So for example, with implicatures, we know that people expect us to say things that provide the right amount of information. We can violate that expectation by saying something that looks like it provides too little or too much information. But we know that when people hear what we said, they will sort of reinterpret it based on those expectations, and they will add some new pragmatic meaning to it to make it fit their expectations. So we can use these expectations, and we can use our breaking of these expectations in a creative way, but a way that still can sort of predictably lead to what kinds of meanings people get. So that's kind of one of the key parts about pragmatics, is that much of pragmatics relies on breaking expectations and violating expectations. But at the same time, those expectations need to be there, and we need to understand them in order to communicate in a pragmatic way, because we can't just, if there were no expectations, we could just say whatever we want and people would interpret it however they want, and that's not what happens. So throughout this whole semester, we've seen many examples of where there are systematic ways that people interpret certain things. And when we break an expectation, when we say something creative or surprising, maybe people do sometimes misinterpret it, but much of the time they interpret it in the way we want to, because we know what people's expectations are, and we can manipulate them in a certain way to express or to convey the meaning that we want to convey. So that's kind of the key of pragmatics. It sort of lies at the border, or the mixture of where sort of expectations and expectation breaking come together, right? So pragmatics is all about breaking expectations, but in order to break expectations, there have to be expectations. And that's what makes pragmatics so special. So many people who do pragmatics would say that pragmatics is actually not part of linguistic grammar in the way that things like syntax and semantics are. So for example, in intro linguistics class, we might learn about things in a certain order, like phonetics, phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, pragmatics. But many pragmaticists would say pragmatics is actually not on the same spectrum with those others. But pragmatics is often its own world, because it follows sort of it's a whole different way of doing things compared to syntax, semantics, and grammar in general. So as we've seen throughout this class, we are all pragmatic communicators, right? So you don't need to take a pragmatics class to learn how to understand what people mean, or to learn how to communicate what you mean, right? Actually, we all do this already. We do it very well. Most of the time, it's very easy. Pragmatics class is about us getting sort of a meta-linguistic understanding of how we do it, but it doesn't teach us how to actually do it, because we already know how to do that. It just teaches us how to explain what we're doing. So what we've seen throughout this class is what are the things that people need to communicate in a pragmatic way? What are all of the abilities that we have and that we use when we communicate pragmatically? So number one, we have to have grammatical competence. So we have to know the rules of grammar and the procedures of grammar. Like we discussed before, if we can't put a sentence together in the first place, then we can't be creative enough to put together a sentence that violates the maxim of relation or violates the maxim of quality or something. So we kind of need the grammatical rules as a foundation. We also need pragmatic competence, right? So to be able to be pragmatic, to be able to say things that are express pragmatic meaning, or to be able to understand other people's pragmatic meaning, we have to know the conventions and expectations of communication. Right? So again, maybe before you took this class, you didn't know that there were these things called the maxim of quality and things like that, but you understood them in your head, even though you didn't have words for them, because you use them all the time when you're communicating. But the idea is to communicate in a pragmatic way. You know, we need to implicitly know that people expect us to communicate in a certain way. And if we say something that seems to violate the expectation, people might recover a certain meaning in a certain way based on that. And we do that by having this pragmatic competence, by sort of knowing what people's expectations are and how they will use those expectations in conversation. And last of all, we also need social competence, by which I mean we sort of need to know the conventions and expectations within a given cultural or social context. Because just like pragmatic communication depends on these pragmatic expectations and maxims, it also depends on social expectations. So the ideas of what's a clear and well-organized way to say something, so like the maxim of manner, or the idea of what's the appropriate amount of information to give in a certain situation, like the maxim of quantity, these are not fixed across cultures, right? So different cultures, different social groups have different expectations about these. So a certain sentence which is under-informative in one context and yields a kind of quantity implicature in that context, if in a different cultural setting, that sentence might be perfectly normal, and it might not mean anything special, because maybe in that context, people are not expected to say that much information. So these are sort of three competences that people need to successfully communicate pragmatically. And we can see sometimes when one of these is missing, for example, a person is in a cultural context they're not familiar with. Maybe they're a second language learner, so they don't have the right grammatical competence. They don't know how to express something in a direct way, so they talk in a kind of wordy way about it. Or maybe they're in a culture where they don't understand, you know, what's the expected way to say hello to someone, so they reply to it in a different way. Many of the examples of where people misinterpret pragmatic meaning could come from cases like this, where someone is missing a piece of one of these competences. But anyway, these are sort of a way we can see how pragmatics fits into grammar and these other things, but also how it's different from them. So to wrap up, I think there are two main lessons that we've been learning about throughout the course of this class. One is the details of how various pragmatic phenomena work. But at the same time, in tandem, we've also been getting practice at thinking critically and questioning the accounts of how these work. So for pretty much every topic we've looked at in pragmatics, we've looked at some explanations of how implicatures work or how illocutionary force works or whatever, but we've also looked at some of the criticisms of it and some of the possible limitations of that. So these are, I think, two separate but both very important lessons that I hope you all take away from this class. Number one, the pragmatic stuff. Ultimately, everything that we talked about in this class has been sort of a very brief overview of these topics in pragmatics. And any of these topics, like implicatures or presuppositions or something, you could have a another whole semester just investigating that topic in more detail. But hopefully you've at least gotten a taste for these topics and what makes them interesting. And maybe you've even gotten interested to go explore them some more. That would be great. But at the same time, on the other hand, like I mentioned, we've also been getting practice in thinking critically about these topics and looking at the claims people make about how presuppositions work or whatever, and thinking about what are potential problems with those claims, what are other possible arguments for them. So this kind of critical thinking is, of course, is very useful in pragmatics, because in pragmatics, people are still debating how things work. But I think it's also a good skill in general. Even if you never talk about pragmatics again, hopefully you've gotten good practice at doing this sort of critical thinking, because it's useful in all parts of your life. So those are the two main lessons that I hope you will take away from this class. And thank you for joining me.